Long before the marble temples of Athens caught the afternoon sun, long before Roman roads crossed the continent, and long before Europe became a name that people used for a shared world, there was an island rising from the blue waters of the eastern Mediterranean, an island of high mountains, hidden caves, fertile valleys, and coastlines folded into natural harbors. This island was Crete, and upon it grew a civilization so inventive, so connected, and so visually alive that modern scholars often describe it as the first great civilization of Europe. Yet for thousands of years its people had no familiar name. Their language could not be read, their rulers were absent from ordinary histories, and their palaces slept beneath fields and olive groves. Only fragments remained above the soil. A carved stone here, a painted shard there, a story of a king and a labyrinth whispered through Greek myth. And so tonight we will travel slowly into that distant world, not to search for a single sensational disaster, but to understand how a society of sailors, farmers, artists, scribes, builders, merchants, and worshippers could flourish for centuries, change beyond recognition, and then become almost invisible to the civilizations that followed. The answer lies not in one lost city or one sudden invasion, but in the delicate way memory survives, in what writing can preserve, in what ruins can conceal, and in how later ages decide which ancestors deserve to be remembered. The people we now call the Minoans did not call themselves Minoans, at least not in any surviving text that scholars can understand. The name was created in the modern age by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, who connected the ruins of Knossos with the legendary King Minos of Crete. In Greek stories, Minos ruled a powerful island kingdom, received laws from Zeus, commanded the sea, and possessed a labyrinth built by the master craftsman Daedalus. Deep within that maze lived the Minotaur, a creature both human and bull, and every generation of storytellers reshaped the tale, making it darker, stranger, or more heroic. Evans believed that archaeology had uncovered the real landscape behind the legend, and his name for the civilization became permanent. Yet the word Minoan is a convenient label rather than the recovered identity of an ancient nation. It gathers many communities and many centuries beneath one title. It can make a changing island look more unified than it truly was, and it can tempt us to imagine one people moving through history with a single purpose. When the archaeological record instead reveals regional differences, shifting centers of influence, local customs, and long periods of adaptation, this uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of its quiet fascination, because the people of Bronze Age Crete remain close enough to see through their houses, tools, paintings and graves, yet distant enough that their own voices still hover just beyond our hearing. Crete occupies a remarkable position in the Mediterranean. To the north lie the islands of the Aegean and the Greek mainland. To the east are Rhodes, Cyprus, and the shores of Anatolia. To the south stretches the sea toward Egypt and Libya, while farther east stand the old lands of the Levant and Mesopotamia. This geography did not make contact automatic. The sea could isolate as easily as it connected. Winter storms were dangerous. Reefs and headlands demanded knowledge, and every voyage depended on timber, rope, sails, food, fresh water, and skilled crews. But Crete offered many points from which sailors could enter the wider world. Its people could look outward without abandoning the resources of their own island. Mountain slopes supported grazing. Valleys produced grain, vines, figs, and olives. Coastal plains allowed settlement, and upland zones held forests. Stone, clay, and places of worship, no single part of the island contained everything. So exchange within Crete mattered almost as much as exchange beyond it. Paths linked farms to villages, villages to ceremonial centers, and inland communities to ports. Over generations, these routes carried baskets. Jars, wool, oil, wine, metals, timber, ideas, songs, and stories. The civilization that emerged was therefore shaped by movement. Not movement without limits, but a repeated rhythm between shore and interior, between household and palace, between local tradition and foreign possibility. Human life on Crete began many millennia before the Palace Age. Farming communities were established during the Neolithic period, and one of the deepest sequences of settlement lies beneath Knossos itself, where layer after layer records people building, repairing, discarding, and rebuilding on the same favored ground. These early inhabitants grew crops, kept animals, shaped pottery, and formed communities long before bronze tools or elaborate frescoes appeared. Their world was not a rough rehearsal for civilization. It was a complete way of life in its own right, sustained by knowledge of seasons, soils, water, seed, livestock, and kinship. Yet through time, the island changed. New techniques arrived, population patterns shifted, and contact with neighboring regions increased. Copper, and then bronze became part of the material world. Specialized crafts developed, settlements expanded, and certain places gained greater influence. The transition was gradual and uneven. With no morning on which the inhabitants awoke and discovered that the Bronze Age had begun, instead, countless small decisions accumulated. A family chose a new vessel shape. A metal worker learned a more effective alloy. A sailor followed a longer route. A community placed storage in a more controlled space, a ritual acquired new symbols, and over centuries, these choices altered the scale of society. By the early second millennium before the Common Era, Crete possessed large architectural centers unlike anything previously built in the region, and the age of the palaces had arrived. The word palace creates an immediate picture, perhaps a royal residence surrounded by guards, servants, and formal gardens. But the great complexes of Crete were more complicated than that image suggests. Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and other centers contained courts, storerooms, workshops, shrines, staircases, corridors, reception areas, and administrative rooms. They may have housed rulers or elite families, yet they also functioned as economic, ceremonial, and political hubs. Their broad central courts could gather people for events. Their magazines held enormous jars, their workshops supported skilled production, and their archives recorded goods and obligations. Some scholars prefer to speak of court complexes or palatial centers because the buildings were not simply private homes enlarged to monumental size. They were institutions woven into the lives of surrounding communities. Farmers might deliver produce, shepherds might provide wool, craftspeople might receive materials, officials might count jars or animals, and worshippers might participate in festivals connected to the authority of the center. The earliest major palaces were established around the beginning of the second millennium before the Common Era. Then many were damaged or destroyed around the 17th century before the Common Era, whether by earthquakes, social disruption, fire, or some mixture of causes. Afterward they were rebuilt with even greater complexity, creating the brilliant period most people imagine when they hear the word Minoan. To walk through a reconstructed plan of Knossos is to encounter architecture designed less like a single statement and more like a living accumulation. Rooms open unexpectedly onto light wells, staircases turn and descend, corridors narrow and widen. Upper stories once rose above walls that now seem low. Painted surfaces changed the atmosphere, wooden columns supported roofs, and open courts brought sky into the center of the complex. The famous sense of a maze may come partly from centuries of alteration. Because the building grew as needs changed, spaces were repurposed, thresholds shifted, and damaged sections were renewed. Yet the complexity was also practical. Different activities required different degrees of access. Storage had to be protected, ceremonies needed controlled approaches. Workshops required light and ventilation, and movement itself could create drama. Someone entering a formal area might pass through darkness before reaching a brighter chamber, or descend toward a room made important by its position and decoration. The builders understood stone, timber, plaster, drainage, and the challenges of earthquake-prone ground. Wooden elements helped structures absorb movement, while carefully laid walls and foundations supported multiple levels. Much of what visitors see today at Knossos has been shaped by modern restoration. But beneath the concrete reconstructions lies genuine evidence of remarkable architectural planning, a place in which function, ritual, display, and sensory experience were inseparable. Water was one of the quiet achievements of these centers. Channels carried rain away from roofs and courts. Drains ran beneath parts of the buildings, wells and springs supplied communities, and terracotta pipes were used in ways that continue to impress modern visitors. It is easy to turn such details into exaggerated claims about luxurious bathrooms or technology far ahead of its time, yet the truth needs no embellishment. Managing water in a large, densely used complex required observation, maintenance, and skilled labor. The people of Crete understood that architecture had to cooperate with the landscape. Winter rain could arrive forcefully, summer dryness demanded storage, and wastewater had to be directed away from occupied spaces. Light wells also helped air move through interior rooms. While plastered surfaces protected walls and made them suitable for color, these systems were not perfect, nor were they identical across the island. But they reveal a society capable of organizing work over long periods, quarrying and transporting stone, preparing timber, shaping pipes, mixing plaster, and coordinating specialists. Behind every elegant staircase stood many hands. Some celebrated, many forgotten, and perhaps some compelled by obligations they did not choose. The beauty of Minoan architecture should therefore be seen alongside the labor that sustained it. Because civilization is never only the vision of an elite, it is also the repeated effort of people carrying baskets, cutting beams, smoothing floors, clearing drains, preparing food, and repairing what time has worn away. The long storerooms of the palaces provide one of the clearest glimpses into the economic system. Rows of massive ceramic jars, known as pithoi, could hold oil, grain, wine, pulses, or other valuable goods. Stone-lined containers and storage bins added further capacity, while ceilings and written records helped administrators track movement. The presence of so much storage suggests collection on a scale beyond the single household. But scholars debate exactly how centralized the economy was. Older interpretations imagine the palace gathering nearly everything and redistributing supplies to a dependent population. Newer approaches often picture a more varied arrangement, with households, villages, local elites, sanctuaries, workshops, and palatial institutions all participating in overlapping networks. The center may have controlled certain prestigious goods, ceremonial resources, land, herds, or specialized production without owning every basket of barley on the island. Storage also had a social meaning. A full magazine displayed security and power. It allowed feasts to be supplied, workers to be supported, offerings to be made, and shortages to be managed. Yet stored wealth could burn, spoil, be stolen, or become a target during conflict. The same concentration that strengthened an institution could make it vulnerable. And when archaeologists find jars broken beneath collapsed walls, they are seeing not only commodities lost in disaster, but the remains of trust, authority, and planning that once connected fields and flocks to the heart of the palace. Agriculture formed the foundation beneath every painted hall and polished vessel. Farmers tended wheat and barley, cultivated vines and olives, gathered figs, cared for gardens, and raised sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. The exact balance varied with region, altitude, rainfall, and access to land, and the island demanded careful use of its diverse environments. Olive trees required patience because they took years to mature. Vines needed seasonal attention, grain harvests depended on uncertain weather, and herds had to be moved through landscapes that could be green in one season and dry in another. Agricultural work shaped the calendar, influenced festivals, and created the surpluses that supported people who did not spend every day producing food. Oil served as nourishment, fuel, medicine, perfume base, offering, and trade good. Wine carried practical and ceremonial value. Wool became the raw material for a major textile industry. And animals supplied meat, milk, hides, bone, traction, and status. None of these products appeared magically in palace storerooms. They came from households whose names are mostly unknown, from women and men who pruned, harvested, spun, ground, carried, and preserved. Their routines rarely entered later myth, but without them there would have been no sailors crossing the Aegean, no painters covering walls, no scribes pressing signs into clay, and no grand gatherings in the central courts. Craft production reached extraordinary levels of skill. Potters created vessels as thin as eggshell and painted them with spirals, flowers, bands, and living forms. Stoneworkers carved bowls from materials that demanded patience. Metalworkers produced tools, weapons, vessels, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. Seal engravers cut tiny designs into hard stones, often fitting animals, people, and complex scenes into surfaces smaller than a thumb. Textile workers transformed wool and plant fibers through spinning, dyeing, weaving, and finishing. Carpenters shaped furniture, doors, ships, and roof beams, while painters worked rapidly on fresh plaster to create frescoes whose surviving fragments still seemed to move. Specialization did not mean that every craftsperson worked inside a palace. Production occurred in households, settlements, ports, and regional centers. But palatial institutions could gather rare materials and commission objects that carried political or sacred meaning. Imported ivory, precious metals, fine stone, and pigments linked artisans to distant supply routes. A single decorated cup might therefore contain the work of farmers, merchants, sailors, miners, potters, painters, and administrators. Craftsmanship also preserved knowledge through apprenticeship. An experienced hand showed a younger one how wet clay should feel, how a drill should be held, how heat changed metal, or how a line could suggest the curve of a dolphin. These lessons were rarely written down, yet they endured for generations in the memory of the body. Crete did not possess abundant sources of every metal required for bronze, so exchange was essential. Copper came from regions including Cyprus and elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean. Tin traveled through long and complicated networks whose complete routes remain uncertain. Gold, silver, ivory, exotic stone, and luxury goods also moved between courts and communities. Minoan objects have been found across the Aegean and beyond, while Egyptian, Levantine, Cycladic, and mainland influences appear on Crete. This was not a simple story of Minoans carrying civilization outward to passive neighbors. Every port was a place of negotiation. Imitation, translation, and selection. Foreign styles could be adopted, changed, or rejected. Merchants might speak several languages. Gifts could establish alliances. And unfamiliar objects could acquire new meanings when they entered another culture. Egyptian images seem to show people from the Aegean bringing goods. Though identifying every figure with certainty is difficult, Cretan pottery reached distant shores, and Minoan artistic ideas strongly affected island and mainland elites. Trade also carried risk. A failed voyage could destroy a season of investment. Piracy or political conflict could close routes, and dependence on imported metal made prosperity sensitive to events far away. The sea enriched Crete, but it also tied the island to a wider system in which disturbances could travel from coast to coast. Later, Greek writers imagined King Minos as the ruler of a powerful navy, and the historian Thucydides described him as an early master of the sea. This inspired the idea of a Minoan thalassocracy, an island empire protected by ships and controlling the Aegean. The image is attractive because Minoan influence was widespread, and the palaces of Crete lack the massive defensive walls associated with Mycenaean citadels. Yet the evidence does not reveal a clearly mapped empire with provinces, governors, and permanent garrisons. Influence may have depended on trade, prestige, religious connections, marriage alliances, temporary force, or the movement of craftspeople. Different Cretan centers may even have competed with one another while sharing broad cultural features. The absence of monumental fortifications does not prove an age without violence. Smaller defenses existed, weapons have been found, and control of routes often requires the possibility of coercion. Nevertheless, Minoan art generally presents a different public mood from the battle scenes of some neighboring societies, emphasizing processions, animals, landscapes, rituals, and athletic display. Perhaps the elite preferred to represent harmony rather than conflict. Perhaps authority was expressed through ceremony and abundance. Or perhaps warfare occurred in forms not chosen for palace walls. Silence in art should never be mistaken for silence in life. But it does tell us what powerful people wanted others to see. The frescoes are among the most intimate surviving doors into Minoan imagination. Blue monkeys climb among rocks, dolphins swim across bright fields, lilies bend, birds perch, processions advance, and human figures appear with narrow waists, patterned garments, elaborate hair, and gestures full of purpose. The colors were governed by artistic convention rather than photographic realism. Male skin was often painted reddish and female skin lighter, bodies were stylized, and many scenes survive only in fragments reconstructed by modern hands. Even so, the choice of subjects is revealing. Nature is not merely a background, it seems active and charged. Flowers, animals, mountains, and sea creatures participate in a world where beauty and sacred presence may have overlapped. The famous bull-leaping scene has inspired endless debate. It appears to show athletes grasping or vaulting over a charging bull. But scholars disagree about whether the depicted movement was physically possible in exactly that form, whether the activity was ritual, sport, initiation, spectacle, or symbolic performance, and whether participants of different genders took part. The image remains powerful because it holds danger and grace together, a human body suspended above immense animal strength. Perhaps this balance captures something central in Minoan visual culture, the desire to approach forces larger than oneself without claiming to dominate them completely. Ordinary life rarely appears as a complete picture, because archaeology preserves some materials better than others, and wealthy settings attract early excavation. Yet houses, tools, cooking vessels, loom weights grinding stones, animal bones, seeds, and traces of streets allow quieter stories to emerge. People woke to tasks shaped by season and status. Fires had to be tended, grain ground, water carried, children watched, animals fed, roofs repaired, cloth spun, meals prepared, and neighbors consulted. Homes ranged from modest structures to substantial townhouses, and some settlements possessed paved areas, drainage, storage rooms, upper floors, and workshops. At places such as Crete on Thera, volcanic burial preserved multi-story buildings and painted interiors with astonishing detail. Though Crete was not on Crete, it belonged to a cultural world deeply connected with Minoan Crete. Daily experience there suggests busy urban life. Imported goods, household shrines, and rooms designed for different activities. The people who occupied these spaces did not think of themselves as examples in a museum. They worried about harvests, relationships, debts, illness, reputation, and the return of ships. Their civilization becomes more understandable when we imagine not only ceremonies in palaces, but also evenings in courtyards. Conversation beside lamps, the smell of bread and oil, and the soft repetition of work learned from parents and grandparents. Minoan society was not equal. Differences in house size, burial wealth, access to imported materials, seal ownership, diet, and proximity to major centers suggest layers of privilege and authority. Some people could command labor, control storage, organize ritual, or distribute valuable goods, while others had fewer choices. But the exact political structure remains uncertain because the main indigenous script has not been deciphered. There are no readable royal chronicles listing conquests or dynasties, and the art does not present kings in the unmistakable way seen in Egypt or Mesopotamia. This absence once encouraged romantic claims that Minoan Crete was peaceful, matriarchal, or ruled by priestesses, especially because women appear prominently in religious imagery. Yet visual prominence does not automatically reveal legal power, inheritance, freedom, or everyday status. Elite women may have held important ceremonial roles, and female divinities may have stood near the center of worship, but the evidence cannot support a simple modern label. Similarly, the so-called throne room at Knossos contains a stone seat that may have belonged to a ruler, priestess, official, or even a divinity represented through ritual. Its meaning changed depending on who used the room and when. The Minoan world invites interpretation, but it also asks for restraint, because certainty can become another kind of myth. Religion seems to have entered nearly every level of Minoan life, but it does not survive as a tidy system with a sacred book and a list of clearly named gods. Instead, archaeologists find repeated symbols, special places offering vessels, figurines, processional scenes, and objects that appear to have carried ritual power. Caves drew worshippers into the earth, peak sanctuaries lifted them toward open sky. Household shrines brought sacred practice into domestic space, and palatial rooms provided settings for ceremonies connected with institutional authority. Mountains were visible across much of Crete, changing color with weather and distance, and their summits could become meeting points between community, landscape, and divine presence. Worshippers carried small clay figures of people or animals to some sanctuaries, perhaps asking for protection, healing, fertility, successful harvests, or the well-being of herds. Liquids may have been poured as offerings, food shared, music performed, and fire used to transform gifts. The exact prayers have vanished, but the repeated journeys remain imaginable, people climbing before dawn, carrying baskets and vessels, pausing on steep paths, then reaching a place where sea, plain, and mountain could be seen together. Religion in such a setting was not separate from geography. It grew from the island itself, from caves that seemed ancient beyond memory, from springs emerging unexpectedly, and from peaks that gathered clouds. Among the most recognizable sacred symbols are the double axe and the horns of consecration. The double axe appears carved on walls, represented in miniature and associated with important spaces, while horn-shaped forms may evoke the powerful head of a bull. Although their precise meanings could vary by context, bulls occupied a strong place in imagery, ritual, and later myth. But they were not the only sacred animals. Birds, snakes, goats, lions, and fantastic creatures also appeared. The famous faience figures, often called snake goddesses, were found at Knossos and heavily restored. Their modern appearance has shaped popular ideas about Minoan religion. Yet the missing parts and the choices made during reconstruction remind us that even iconic objects can be partly modern creations. Scenes on seals and rings show figures standing before shrines, approaching trees, raising arms, or witnessing what may be divine appearances. Some scholars interpret these as moments of epiphany, in which ritual movement, music, altered attention, and symbolic objects made a deity present. Others urge caution because a tiny engraved image can support several readings. What seems certain is that performance mattered. Gesture mattered, clothing mattered, and carefully arranged space mattered. Minoan worship was likely experienced through sound, movement, scent, light, food, and touch, not only through beliefs that could be summarized in words. Music and communal gathering probably helped bind society together. Frescoes and objects suggest instruments such as lyres, pipes, rattles, and percussion. While processions imply coordinated movement and public display, a festival might have drawn people from farms and villages toward a central court, where officials, ritual specialists, athletes, craftspeople, and visitors entered an ordered sequence. Fine cups were produced in enormous numbers, and some deposits suggest drinking on a scale far beyond an ordinary household meal. Feasting could honor deities, confirm alliances, distribute surplus, reward service, display generosity, and remind participants who controlled access to valuable resources. The pleasure of food and music did not erase politics. It made politics tangible. A leader who could fill jars, slaughter animals, provide wine, and organize spectacle demonstrated command over land and labor. Yet participants were not simply passive. Festivals allowed communities to meet, exchange news, arrange marriages, renew obligations, and judge the strength of institutions. Moments of celebration could therefore reinforce authority while also revealing weakness. If supplies failed, if rival groups were excluded, or if ritual promises seemed unanswered after disaster, confidence might fade. The palace was strongest when people believed its order connected human prosperity with the larger order of seasons and gods. Writing developed on Crete in several forms, first through a script commonly called Cretan hieroglyphic, and later through Linear A. Both remain undeciphered, although scholars can identify signs, numbers, recurring patterns, and probable administrative functions. The term hieroglyphic describes the pictorial appearance of some signs but does not mean the script worked like Egyptian hieroglyphs. Linear A used more abstract forms and appeared on clay tablets, ceilings, vessels, stone objects, and other materials. It was employed across much of Crete and at some sites beyond the island. Many inscriptions are brief, and the surviving body of text is limited, which makes decipherment extremely difficult. A script can be approached by comparing sign frequencies, repeated endings, numerical systems, and archaeological context. But without a bilingual inscription or a securely known underlying language, proposed solutions often collapse under testing. Some signs resemble those later used in Linear B, yet similar signs do not guarantee identical sounds. And even sound values would not automatically reveal meaning if the language itself is unknown. Linear A is therefore both present and silent. Hundreds of ancient hands left marks that can be copied with precision, but the thoughts behind them remain largely closed. This silence is one of the greatest reasons the civilization slipped from historical memory. The surviving tablets were not designed to last for thousands of years. Most were made from clay and used for short-term administration. They may have recorded deliveries, allocation, personnel, livestock, land, offerings, or stored goods, then been discarded or recycled when no longer needed. Fire accidentally preserved many examples by baking the clay hard during destruction. An archive that functioned smoothly might leave less behind than one consumed by flames, which creates a strange archaeological bias. Disaster becomes the guardian of information. Scribes probably worked within trained traditions, learning sign forms, numerical notation, commodity symbols, and the routines of particular offices. Some records were sealed or attached to containers and doors, making administration part of the physical movement of goods. Writing did not necessarily reach most inhabitants, and literacy may have remained concentrated among specialists. Yet even people who could not read understood the authority of sealed storerooms, marked tablets, measured quantities, and officials who counted what entered or left. Bureaucracy can appear dry when reduced to lists, but every number represented something material. Jars of oil, flocks of sheep, lengths of cloth, workers to be fed, offerings promised, or harvests expected. Behind the signs stood relationships between center and countryside, and those relationships had to be maintained season after season. One mysterious object, the Phaistos disc, has become famous far beyond its archaeological context. Found in 1908 at the Palace of Phaistos, it bears signs impressed in a spiral on both sides, many of them made with reusable stamps, an unusual technique for its time. The symbols include human figures, animals, plants, tools, and shapes whose meanings remain unknown because the disc is unique and the inscription is short. It cannot be deciphered with confidence. Countless people have claimed to read it as a prayer, calendar, hymn, military message, game, or foreign text. But no proposed solution has gained broad acceptance. Its fame reveals how strongly modern audiences desire a direct voice from the Minoan world. One object seems to promise the key to everything, yet archaeology rarely yields such convenient answers. The disc may have been made locally or brought from elsewhere. It may represent a script not otherwise preserved, or a special display that never became common. Its uncertainty should not disappoint us, because it demonstrates the variety of communication in the Bronze Age. Writing was not a single invention moving along one straight path. Communities experimented with signs, surfaces, seals, images, and numbers, and some experiments disappeared after leaving only one surviving trace. death offers another view of social identity. Minoan communities used tombs of several forms, including circular communal structures known as tholos tombs in parts of southern Crete, chamber tombs cut into earth or rock, house-shaped tombs, caves, and burial buildings used across generations. Bodies could be placed with pottery, tools, jewelry, seals, weapons, food, or ritual objects, then moved or rearranged as tombs received later burials. Communal treatment of the dead may have strengthened family or lineage memory. While richer grave goods distinguished status, practices changed through time and varied by region, showing again that there was no single unchanging Minoan custom. The dead remained part of the social landscape. Tombs stood near roots or settlements. Ceremonies brought the living back to ancestral places, and old bones could be handled with care. Death was not simply an ending, but a transformation requiring action, remembrance, and material offerings, yet names are mostly lost. A necklace survives without the story of who wore it. A cup remains without the voice that raised it. And a seal outlasts the authority it once represented. This imbalance between durable object and vanished person lies at the heart of prehistory. We can recover patterns across thousands of lives while knowing almost none of those lives individually. Crete was never culturally still. The western, central, eastern, coastal, and upland regions developed in different ways. Knossos became exceptionally large and influential, but it was not the only center of innovation. Phaistos overlooked the fertile Mazara plain. Malea stood near important northern routes. Zakros connected eastern Crete to maritime networks. Cydonia occupied the area of modern Chania in the west, and Zominthos created a striking highland center near Mount Ida. Smaller towns such as Gornia revealed dense settlement and craft activity, while rural villas and regional buildings suggest local authorities operating between palace and village. The relationships among these places remain debated. Knossos may have exercised broad influence during certain periods, yet evidence for a single island-wide state is uncertain. Political arrangements could have shifted between cooperation, competition, alliance, ritual hierarchy, and direct control. A merchant sailing from the east might encounter customs different from those of central Crete. A potter in one region might imitate a fashionable style while preserving local techniques, and a sanctuary could attract visitors across political boundaries. Using one name for the whole island helps discussion, but the lived reality was probably a mosaic, united by shared practices and divided by local loyalties. Near the transition into the 17th century before the Common Era, many early palatial centers suffered severe destruction. Earthquakes are an obvious possibility because Crete lies in an active tectonic region, but fire, conflict, and social change may also have contributed. The event or series of events did not end complex society. Instead, major centers were rebuilt, often on an even grander scale. This response is important because it shows resilience. Institutions retained enough authority, labor, knowledge, and resources to reorganize after loss. Builders incorporated earlier foundations, redesigned spaces, expanded courts, improved circulation, and renewed decorative programs. The rebuilt palaces became the setting for what archaeologists call the Neopalatial period, an age of wide Minoan influence and extraordinary artistic achievement. Recovery may have strengthened certain centers while weakening others, and reconstruction itself could have changed political relationships. People who controlled rebuilding could claim sacred favor or practical competence. Communities might accept new obligations in exchange for protection and renewed storage. Disasters do not affect everyone equally. Some families lose land while others gain it. Some workshops disappear while competitors expand. And some traditions are presented as ancient even when they have recently been reinvented. The brilliance of the new palace age may therefore have risen from a landscape that had already experienced deep disruption. During the height of the Neopalatial world, roughly between the 17th and 15th centuries before the Common Era, Minoan styles traveled across the Aegean. Cretan pottery, fresco techniques, seals, jewelry, and ritual forms influence communities from the Cyclades to the Greek mainland. Minoan craftspeople may have worked abroad. Foreign elites adopted Cretan imagery to express refinement and power, and ships carried goods through networks that connected multiple languages and political systems. The settlement of Akrotiri on Thera preserves perhaps the most vivid example of this interconnected culture. Its buildings contained storage rooms, workshops, staircases, and frescoes showing landscapes, ships, towns, animals, and elegantly dressed people. Some scenes have been interpreted as festivals, voyages, or narratives, though their precise meaning is uncertain. The town was buried by volcanic material before its life could be transformed by later rebuilding. Creating a still image of a busy society, no bodies have been found in the excavated areas, suggesting that warning earthquakes may have allowed inhabitants to leave. But where they went and how many survived remains unknown. Akrotiri reminds us that the Minoan world extended beyond Crete, not as a simple colonial map, but as a web of communities sharing styles while maintaining their own identities. The island of Thera, now called Santorini, was shaped by a volcano that had erupted many times before the Bronze Age. Beneath the beautiful cliffs and curved caldera lay a restless geological system. Sometime during the later 17th or earlier 16th century before the Common Era, after a sequence of warning activity, the volcano produced one of the largest eruptions known from human history. Pumice and ash buried Akrotiri. Columns of material rose high into the atmosphere. Pyroclastic flows swept across the island, and the collapse of the volcanic structure transformed the landscape. Tsunamis moved through the Aegean and struck nearby coasts, including parts of northern and eastern Crete. The exact date remains debated because archaeological chronologies and scientific dating have not always aligned perfectly. But the central fact is secure: the eruption was immense, and communities connected to Thera faced sudden loss. Harbors, ships, fields, homes, and trading relationships could be damaged even where ash did not fall deeply. People who escaped the first disaster became refugees. Survivors had to find food and shelter, and news of the event traveled through the maritime world. For those who witnessed the darkened horizon or floating pumice, the eruption must have seemed like a rupture in the order of nature. For much of the 20th century, the eruption of Thera was presented as the dramatic event that destroyed Minoan civilization. The story had the satisfying shape of legend. A brilliant island society struck by nature in a single catastrophe, sometimes even connected with the tale of Atlantis. But archaeology has made the picture more complicated. The main palaces on Crete did not all fall at the moment of the eruption, and Minoan culture continued afterward. Some centers remained prosperous, new buildings were constructed, trade resumed, and art developed. This does not mean the eruption was harmless. Tsunami deposits, coastal damage, ash effects, disrupted shipping, lost partners, and psychological shock could have weakened the system in ways that are difficult to measure. A society may survive a disaster while carrying hidden strains for decades. Reserves are spent, political confidence is tested, routes shift, and rivals take advantage. The eruption may therefore have been one factor in a longer transformation, rather than the single cause of collapse. Historians increasingly resist explanations that make one dramatic event do all the work, because complex societies are held together by many connections, and they usually change when several pressures interact. In the generations after the eruption, the palatial system continued, but signs of tension may be visible in altered ritual practices, changing settlement patterns, defensive concerns, and uneven prosperity. Interpretations differ because evidence varies from site to site. At some places, life seems to recover. At others, disruption appears more severe. Rulers or councils may have faced demands for rebuilding and protection, merchants may have redirected voyages, and communities may have questioned institutions that claimed a special relationship with divine order. If the palaces had presented themselves as centers capable of maintaining harmony, a volcanic catastrophe and repeated earthquakes could challenge that image. Yet religious systems are flexible. Disaster can strengthen devotion as easily as weaken it. New ceremonies may arise, old spaces may be closed, and leaders may explain suffering in ways that preserve authority. Economic pressures also mattered. The loss of ships or ports would affect metal supply, luxury production, and the distribution of food. While competition with increasingly powerful mainland societies could reshape the balance of the Aegean, no surviving document describes these debates, so archaeology must work indirectly, following burned layers, imported pottery, weapon deposits, repaired walls, abandoned rooms, and changes in burial custom. Around the middle of the 15th century before the Common Era, destruction swept through many important sites on Crete. Palaces and settlements burned or were abandoned, especially outside Knossos. This horizon marks a major break in the island's political order, but its cause remains one of the central debates of Aegean archaeology. Invasion by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland is a strong possibility, especially because Greek language administration later appears at Knossos in Linear B. Weapons and mainland styles become more prominent, and the pattern could reflect conquest. Yet the evidence does not require one coordinated army landing everywhere at once. Internal conflict among Cretan centers, rebellion against palace authority, competition between elites, renewed earthquakes, and disruption of trade may have created opportunities for outsiders or local groups aligned with them. The destruction could have unfolded in stages rather than as a single campaign. Knossos survived and may have benefited from the fall of rivals, perhaps extending control across parts of the island. The transition was therefore not simply Minoans disappearing and Mycenaeans replacing them. Many inhabitants remained, crafts continued, religious traditions persisted, and newcomers adopted local practices. Political power changed more sharply than population. The Mycenaeans came from the Greek mainland, where centers such as Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Tiryns developed powerful elites, fortified citadels, rich burials, and wide connections. They admired and borrowed from Cretan culture long before they gained authority on Crete. Minoan objects entered mainland graves, fresco painting and seal carving influenced Mycenaean art, and Cretan religious symbols appeared in mainland settings. This borrowing complicates any simple contrast between peaceful islanders and warlike Greeks. The two worlds had been entangled for generations. When Greek speakers eventually used Knossos as an administrative center, they adapted the older Linear A tradition into Linear B, a script designed to record an early form of Greek. The tablets list goods, personnel, animals, land, textiles, offerings, chariots, and weapons, revealing a highly organized palace economy. But they do not narrate the conquest of Crete or explain how power changed hands. The people writing Greek at Knossos may have included immigrants, local descendants, bilingual administrators, and families of mixed background. Cultural identity was not a sealed container. It could shift through marriage, service, fashion, language, and political loyalty. What appears archaeologically as a new era may have been experienced by individuals as a confusing mixture of continuity and loss. Knossos continued as a major center after the widespread destructions, and its later archives contain Linear B tablets, some dating around the 14th century before the Common Era. These records show Greek-speaking administrators using a script descended from Minoan invention. They managed flocks, textiles, agricultural goods, craft workers, military equipment, and offerings to deities. Some divine names familiar from later Greek religion appear in Linear B. Though Bronze Age worship differed from classical practice, Knossos may have ruled a large territory during this phase, but the extent and duration of its control remain debated. Eventually, the palace itself suffered a final major destruction, often placed around the later 14th century before the Common Era. Though chronology is complex and parts of the site continued to be used, with the loss of Knossos as a dominant palace, Crete entered a more fragmented political landscape. Mycenaean culture remained influential, and communities persisted in towns, villages, farms, and sanctuaries. The palace system declined, but life did not stop. This distinction matters because archaeology once described changes from the viewpoint of monumental centers. When a palace burned, the civilization was said to end, yet most people had never lived in the grandest rooms. They adjusted to new authorities, new routes, and new forms of community. By the 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean entered another period of widespread upheaval. Mycenaean palaces on the mainland were destroyed, long-distance trade contracted, political systems fractured, populations moved, and new forms of settlement appeared. Crete shared in this larger transformation. Though each region followed its own path, communities shifted toward defensible upland locations in some areas, coastal centers changed, and older institutions lost their ability to organize labor and exchange on a grand scale. The collapse around 1200 before the Common Era was not the original fall of the Minoans, whose palatial independence had already faded, but it further separated later generations from the Bronze Age world. Scripts disappeared, administrative traditions ended, and memories once held in institutions became harder to maintain. When writing returned to Greece centuries later in an alphabet borrowed and adapted from Phoenician models, it belonged to societies with different political structures and different ways of remembering. There was no continuous archive linking the New Age to the palaces, no line of scribes copying Minoan records through the centuries, and no surviving school preserving the language of Linear A. The past became a landscape of ruins, heirlooms, tombs, sacred places, and stories whose original meanings could no longer be checked. This break in written continuity is perhaps the single most important reason the first great civilization of Europe was forgotten. Egypt possessed inscriptions carved into stone, royal names repeated across temples, and a long tradition of monumental remembrance. Mesopotamian cities left immense archives of clay tablets in scripts that later scholars could eventually decipher. The Minoan world left writing too, but most of it was brief, administrative, and written in a language still unknown. Even if every surviving Linear A sign were pronounced tomorrow, the texts would remain limited compared with the chronicles, law codes, letters, hymns, and royal inscriptions known elsewhere. The palaces may have kept records on perishable materials that vanished, but no such literature survives. Without readable names, victories, genealogies, or myths written by the people themselves, later historians could not place them inside a familiar narrative. They became anonymous ancestors, known through things rather than testimony, and objects are patient but indirect witnesses. A painted room can show what a society valued without explaining the event depicted. A seal can display authority without naming its owner, and a storage jar can reveal abundance without telling us who decided how it would be shared. The people of later Greece did not live in complete ignorance of the old world. They inhabited the same landscapes, encountered ancient walls, reused tombs, found bronze objects, and told stories about heroic rulers who belonged to a time greater and stranger than their own. Memory did not vanish, it changed form. The names Knossos and Crete continued, and Homeric poetry described Crete as a rich island of many cities and peoples. But the poems were composed within oral traditions centuries after the height of Minoan palaces, combining distant memory with the social concerns of later audiences. A ruin could become the palace of a legendary king. An old sacred cave could be connected with the birth of Zeus. A bull image could merge with tales of tribute and monsters. And the complicated plan of Knossos could inspire or reinforce the idea of a labyrinth. Myth preserved emotional truth and cultural memory without serving as a precise archaeological report. Later, Greeks remembered that Crete had once been powerful, sacred, and connected with the sea, but they did not possess our modern category of Minoan civilization. They knew legends, local traditions, and impressive remains. Not a reconstructed Bronze Age chronology, the story of Minos carried several versions. In some traditions, he was a wise lawgiver who met Zeus at regular intervals. In others, he was a severe ruler demanding tribute from Athens. His wife Pasiphae became entangled in the origin of the Minotaur. Daedalus built the labyrinth. Ariadne helped Theseus escape with a thread, and Minos later pursued the craftsman across the sea. These tales contain themes that resonate with archaeological Crete, bulls, complex buildings, maritime power, ritual foreign contact, and skilled craftsmanship, yet direct one-to-one identifications are dangerous. Myths are shaped over centuries and can gather elements from many periods. The labyrinth might reflect Knossos, a cave, a dance pattern, an Egyptian design, or simply the imaginative needs of a compelling story. The word itself has uncertain origins. And Evans's connection between the double axe and the labyrinth is no longer accepted without question. Nevertheless, myth acted like a dim lamp left burning through the centuries. It did not reveal the rooms clearly, but it prevented total darkness. When archaeologists arrived in the 19th century, they followed that light, searching the Cretan landscape for places where legend and buried architecture might meet. Classical Greek civilization came to dominate European ideas of ancient history, especially from the Renaissance onward. Philosophers, dramatists, historians, sculptors, and democratic institutions from Athens became central to education, while Rome offered law, empire, engineering, and Latin literature. The Bronze Age societies before them seemed vague and primitive because their scripts could not be read and their monuments were less visible. This created a false impression that advanced European history began suddenly with the Greeks of the first millennium before the Common Era. In reality, classical culture grew from a much deeper Aegean past, inheriting religious names, artistic motifs, agricultural practices, maritime roots, and stories transformed across generations. Yet cultural memory tends to simplify ancestry. Later, Greeks themselves looked toward heroic ages rather than archaeological periods, and modern Europeans often preferred a clean origin story centered on Athens. The Minoans complicated that story. Their art did not resemble the restrained white marble ideal imagined by early modern admirers of Greece. Their strongest images featured color, movement, ritual, women, animals, and the sea. And their language seemed unrelated to later Greek. They represented a Europe whose foundations were connected deeply with Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and the wider Mediterranean. Travelers had visited Crete and searched for the labyrinth long before scientific excavation. Ancient authors offered conflicting locations. Medieval and early modern maps placed the maze in caves or invented landscapes. Local guides connected striking ruins with familiar legends, and collectors acquired carved stones without understanding their age. Under Venetian and Ottoman rule, Crete remained a place of layered history, where Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Venetian, and ancient remains stood near living villages. The Bronze Age was difficult to isolate because later settlement covered or reused earlier sites, and excavating required political permission, money, labor, and a developing method for distinguishing layers. 19th century archaeology was itself changing rapidly. Excavations at Troy, Mycenae, Egypt, and Mesopotamia demonstrated that legendary or forgotten worlds could be recovered materially, but the discipline also carried the ambitions of European empires. Museums competed for objects, scholars sought national prestige, and local knowledge was often treated as secondary. Crete attracted archaeologists from several countries, each aware that uncovering the island's early past could reshape the history of Europe. In 1878, before Arthur Evans began his famous work, a Cretan merchant, antiquarian, and scholar named Minos Kalokairenos excavated part of the hill called Kephala at Knossos. He uncovered walls, storerooms, and enormous pithoi, recognizing that the remains belonged to an ancient building of great importance. His work was limited by the political conditions of Ottoman-controlled Crete and by fears that major finds might be removed from the island, but news of the discovery spread internationally. Kalokairenos showed visitors the site and shared objects, helping attract the attention of foreign archaeologists. His role was later overshadowed by the scale and publicity of Evans's excavations, Another example of how historical memory can favor the person with greater institutional power, publication resources, and control over interpretation. The rediscovery of Knossos was not the achievement of one solitary genius. It depended on Cretan curiosity, local landowners, workers, officials, artists, foremen, scholars, and political changes that eventually allowed excavation to proceed. Remembering Kalokairenos corrects the story without denying Evans's enormous contribution, and it reminds us that the question of who discovers the past is often entangled with who is permitted to speak for it. Heinrich Schliemann, famous for his excavations at Troy and Mycenae, also recognized the promise of Knossos and tried to obtain the land. But negotiations failed. Arthur Evans visited Crete in the 1890s, fascinated by engraved seal stones bearing unfamiliar signs. He suspected that an early writing system awaited discovery, and after Crete gained autonomy, he acquired the site and began large-scale excavation in 1900. The results came with astonishing speed. Walls, staircases, fresco fragments, storerooms and shrines, tablets, and the stone seat of the so-called throne room emerged from the earth. Evans believed he had found the palace of Minos and the historical core of the labyrinth. He organized the material into a chronology of early, middle, and late Minoan periods, with further subdivisions based largely on pottery styles. This system, though refined and challenged, gave scholars a framework for discussing centuries of change. His vast publication, The Palace of Minos, gathered evidence and interpretation on a monumental scale, and his term, Minoan, entered museums, textbooks, and public imagination. A forgotten civilization seemed to return almost overnight. The speed of excavation was both productive and destructive. Hundreds of workers removed soil across a vast complex, revealing architecture before modern recording methods existed. Evans documented much, employed skilled assistants, and preserved features that might otherwise have deteriorated. Yet some contexts were misunderstood or lost, and his certainty sometimes outran the evidence. He named rooms according to his interpretations, such as the throne room, Queen's Megaron, Hall of the Double Axes, and royal apartments, labels that still shape how visitors imagine the building even when their original functions remain uncertain. He also restored frescoes from small fragments, asking artists to complete missing bodies, colors, and scenes. These reconstructions were visually persuasive and helped the public see a living world. But they could turn hypothesis into apparent fact. Later, scholars have re-examined the fragments and proposed different arrangements. The famous Prince of the Lilies, for example, may combine pieces that did not belong to one figure. Archaeology is always an argument between what survives and what is supplied by imagination. At Knossos, that argument was built into the walls themselves. Evans faced a practical problem. Once uncovered mud brick, plaster, timber impressions, and fragile masonry began to decay under sun and rain. He responded with extensive reconstruction, eventually using reinforced concrete, painted columns, roofs, and rebuilt upper levels. His interventions protected some areas and created one of the most memorable archaeological sites in the world. But they also imposed an early 20th century vision upon Bronze Age remains. Colors were chosen, heights estimated, and spaces completed according to theories that later changed. Visitors now move through a hybrid place, part ancient ruin, part modern conservation project, part imaginative stage. This does not make Knossos false. It makes it historically layered. The site tells two stories at once: the story of Minoan builders and the story of modern people trying to recover them. Concrete ages differently from ancient stone, and preservation choices made a century ago continue to challenge conservators. The palace therefore teaches humility. Every attempt to save the past alters it. Doing nothing allows loss. Doing too much may conceal uncertainty, and the balance between protection and authenticity is never simple. Other excavations across Crete broadened the picture beyond Evans's Knossos. Italian archaeologists worked at Phaistos and nearby sites. French teams investigated Malea. Greek scholars explored many regions, and the American archaeologist Harriet Boyd Hawes directed excavations at Gornia in the early 20th century, uncovering an entire town with streets, houses, workshops, and a small central complex. Her work drew attention to urban life beyond the Grand Palace. Although she too worked within the assumptions of her era, later Nicolaus Platon excavated the palace at Zakros, where sealed destruction layers and rich objects revealed the importance of eastern Crete. Discoveries at Komos, Mochlos, Palaikastro, Petras, Chania, and numerous rural sites continued to challenge the idea that one capital could represent the whole island. Each excavation added different evidence. Ports showed overseas contact, villages revealed domestic economies, cemeteries traced community identity, and sanctuaries mapped ritual landscapes. The Minoans were gradually transformed from Evans's elegant palace society into a much more varied population. Modern archaeology increasingly asked not only how elites lived, but how food was produced, how children grew, how diseases affected bodies, how crafts were organized, and how local environments changed. The excitement surrounding Minoan discovery was shaped by the cultural concerns of the early 20th century. Many Europeans wanted to find the origins of their civilization, and Crete offered an ancient society that appeared sophisticated, artistic, and recognizably European. Evans sometimes described the Minoans in contrast with peoples to the east. Even though the archaeological evidence showed continuous exchange across the Mediterranean, ideas about race, progress, gender, and national character entered interpretations. As they did throughout archaeology of that period, the peaceful Minoan became a useful image. An elegant maritime people, supposedly unlike the militaristic Mycenaeans, while prominent female figures inspired visions of a matriarchal society. These theories appealed to modern hopes and anxieties, but they often rested on selective evidence. Minoan art certainly differs from Mycenaean public imagery, and women clearly played important visible roles. Yet no civilization is fully described by one contrast. Weapons, fortifications, hierarchy, and coercion existed on Crete, just as trade, art, and ritual flourished on the mainland. Separating cultures into peaceful and warlike types tells us as much about modern storytellers as about ancient people. The first generations of scholars also tended to treat palaces as the engines of every important development, because monumental buildings produced spectacular discoveries and could be compared with royal centers elsewhere. Villages and households appeared secondary, while the term civilization became closely tied to central authority. Luxury art and writing later research has complicated this palace-centered model, showing that communities outside the great complexes maintained their own traditions, controlled resources, participated in regional exchange, and sometimes survived when central institutions fell. The palace did not invent every style or command every economic action. It depended on networks whose members could negotiate, resist, imitate, or withdraw. This change in perspective also alters the meaning of collapse. If civilization is defined only by palaces, then their destruction looks like total extinction. If civilization includes language, ritual, farming knowledge, kinship, craft practice, and local memory, then much continued beneath a new political surface. The Minoan world was not a machine switched off by one blow. It was a living pattern that unraveled in some places, tightened in others, and was rewoven with Mycenaean and later Cretan threads. As museums displayed frescoes, pottery, gold seals, and figurines, the recovered civilization entered popular culture. Dancers, designers, novelists, psychologists, painters, and filmmakers borrowed its imagery. The labyrinth became a symbol of the mind. The Minotaur represented hidden fear, and the bright frescoes suggested a lost age of freedom beside the sea. Tourism brought visitors to Knossos, where reconstructed red columns and painted dolphins created an immediate visual identity. This popularity rescued the Minoans from obscurity, but also surrounded them with new fantasies. Atlantis theories, goddess movements, imagined rituals, and claims of advanced technology often blurred evidence and desire. The civilization became famous without becoming fully understood. A curious reversal of forgetting, The name Minoan is now widely recognized, yet the actual complexity of Bronze Age Crete can disappear behind a few repeated images. Bull lepers, snake goddesses, labyrinths, and volcanic destruction. To remember the Minoans honestly requires more than replacing silence with romance. It requires allowing uncertainty, regional difference, ordinary labor, political conflict, and gradual transformation into the story. The clay tablets from Knossos offered the greatest hope of restoring an ancient voice. Evans recognized two main linear scripts and named them Linear A and Linear B. He believed Linear B probably represented a non-Greek Minoan language, and for decades the signs resisted every attempt to read them. Progress came through patient classification rather than sudden intuition. Scholars compared repeated groups, counted signs, separated words from numbers and commodity symbols, and studied how endings changed. The American classicist Alice Kober made a crucial advance by arranging thousands of sign groups on hand-cut cards and identifying patterns now called Kober triplets. Her work demonstrated that the underlying language was inflected, meaning word forms changed according to grammatical function. She avoided premature guesses and built a structure that others could test. Emmett Bennett clarified the sign system and tablet organization. While discoveries from Pylos on the mainland provided new material, the decipherment was therefore a collective achievement assembled across years of disciplined labor, even though one name would become most closely associated with the final breakthrough. Michael Ventris first encountered the tablets as a schoolboy and carried the puzzle into adult life while working as an architect. He corresponded widely, circulated work notes, tested possibilities, and initially doubted that the language could be Greek. Then patterns in place names and sign values began to align. In 1952, he proposed that Linear B recorded an early form of Greek, a conclusion confirmed and developed with the linguist John Chadwick. The result transformed Aegean history. Greek was suddenly documented centuries earlier than scholars had known, and the later administration at Knossos could be connected linguistically with the Mycenaean mainland. Tablets that once seemed mute now listed wool, oil, grain, people, animals, vessels, weapons, land, and offerings. They revealed scribes concerned with precise quantities rather than epic storytelling. Yet their very ordinariness made the past more human. The earliest readable Greek did not arrive as poetry or philosophy. It appeared in accounts, inventories, and institutional routine. The civilization recovered through myth was joined by the sound of clerks managing a palace. The success with Linear B did not unlock Linear A, although many signs share similar forms. The earlier script represented a different language, and the values borrowed into Linear B may not apply consistently backward. Scholars can read numerical notations and recognize recurring groups, probable place names, and administrative formats. But the language remains unidentified. Suggestions have linked it with languages from Anatolia, the Eastern Mediterranean, or entirely lost families. None has one general agreement. The surviving inscriptions are also too short and repetitive to provide the rich context needed for secure decipherment. There is no Minoan equivalent of the Rosetta Stone presenting the same message in a known language. Every proposed translation must explain the whole system, not merely produce a plausible meaning for a few signs. This unfinished puzzle preserves the deepest boundary between us and the people of the new Palace Age. We can trace the movement of their goods, reconstruct rooms where scribes worked, and hold exact copies of their signs. But we cannot yet hear their names for the island, their deities, their institutions, or themselves. Modern archaeology approaches the Minoan past through methods Evans could scarcely have imagined. Radiocarbon dating refines sequences. Microscopic analysis identifies plant remains and residues. Isotope studies can reveal diet and movement. Ancient DNA offers cautious insight into ancestry. Geological research traces earthquakes, volcanic ash, and tsunami deposits, while digital mapping reconstructs routes, visibility, settlement density, and access to resources. Chemical analysis can identify where pottery, clay, or metal originated. showing that an object found in one palace may have traveled from another region. Examination of human bones reveals injury, disease, nutrition, and physical labor, and the study of animal remains clarifies herding, sacrifice, and food choice. These techniques do not produce one final answer. They create many smaller corrections. A jar once assumed to contain wine may hold traces of oil or scented substances. A person buried locally may have grown up elsewhere. A destruction layer thought simultaneous may belong to events separated by years. The past becomes more detailed and less tidy, which is a sign of progress rather than failure. When scholars ask what ended Minoan civilization, they must first decide which ending they mean. The first great destruction of the early palaces did not end it. The eruption of Thera did not end it immediately. The widespread destructions around the middle of the 15th century transformed political independence across much of Crete. The later fall of Knossos ended a major administrative center, and the upheavals around 1200 before the Common Era brought another deep reorganization. Each event affected different communities in different ways. There was no single day on which every Minoan custom vanished. The search for one cause often reflects a modern preference for dramatic explanations. Volcano invasion, earthquake, drought, rebellion, or economic collapse, but complex systems usually fail through interaction. Natural disasters strain resources, political rivalry blocks cooperation. Trade disruption reduces wealth, military pressure exploits weakness, and public confidence declines when institutions can no longer meet expectations. The most responsible answer is therefore layered. The Minoan palatial order was repeatedly damaged, rebuilt, challenged, conquered, and absorbed. While the people themselves continued, the Thera eruption remained central because its scale was extraordinary and because it offers such a vivid image of catastrophe. But distance and chronology matter. Crete lay far enough away to escape total burial. Ash distribution varied with winds, and the most severe tsunami effects were concentrated along exposed coasts. Inland palaces could survive while ports and fleets suffered. The loss of Akrotiri and other island communities may have broken commercial and social links that cannot be measured by ruined walls alone. Merchants lost partners, families lost relatives, and religious authorities faced an event beyond ordinary experience. Recovery may have required years, yet later Minoan prosperity shows that resilience was real. The eruption should be understood as a powerful shock within a vulnerable network, not as a magical explanation that removes the need to study politics, economics, and human choice. Even the greatest natural event becomes history through the way societies respond to it. Earthquakes were a recurring reality on Crete. Buildings could be repaired after moderate damage, but repeated shocks might weaken walls, destroy stored goods, alter springs, and force communities to rebuild at great cost. Palatial architecture incorporated timber and other flexible elements, suggesting long experience with seismic risk, yet no design could eliminate danger. Earthquake damage is also difficult to distinguish from later collapse, fire, or deliberate destruction, so scholars must compare wall movement, fallen masonry, human remains, repair phases, and regional geology. One center might be struck severely while another continued, producing political consequences beyond the physical loss. Rivals could seize roots, displaced people could move into new districts, and sacred interpretations could intensify fear. The earth itself was part of the historical actor, not because it determined human destiny, but because it repeatedly changed the conditions within which decisions were made. Conflict also leaves an uneven record. Weapons occur throughout Minoan Crete. Defensive positions existed and violent injuries appear. Although the public art of the palaces did not celebrate battle as prominently as some neighboring traditions, warfare may have involved raids, elite competition, control of ports, or struggles within the island. The destructions around the 15th century could reflect attacks by mainland forces, internal factions, or both. A successful takeover rarely depends only on an invader's strength. It also depends on divisions among those being conquered, alliances with local elites, and the ability to control food, roads, harbors, and administration after victory, the Mycenaean presence at Knossos suggests a major shift. But the adoption of Minoan symbols by new rulers shows that conquest required cultural negotiation. Authority was more effective when it appeared connected to established sacred and economic traditions. The conqueror often survives by becoming partly like the conquered. Environmental pressure beyond sudden disaster may have added further strain. Changes in rainfall, erosion, forest use, grazing, and agricultural intensity affected local productivity. Though evidence does not support a simple island-wide ecological collapse caused by careless inhabitants, Crete contains many micro-environments, and communities responded differently to dry years or soil loss. Terraces, crop diversity, storage, exchange, and herd movement could reduce risk, but systems built on surplus remained vulnerable when several harvests failed or transport was interrupted. Palace demands might become harder to meet. Farmers could abandon marginal land, and competition over secure water or fertile valleys could sharpen. Climate is most useful as part of a social explanation. The same drought can be manageable under cooperative institutions and disastrous under divided leadership. Nature creates pressure, but politics decides how burdens are shared. Trade networks gave Minoan centers access to metals, luxury materials, and prestige, yet dependence on those networks created sensitivity to distant change. If routes shifted toward mainland powers, if Cyprus or Levantine ports favored new partners, or if conflict made voyages more dangerous, Cretan elites could lose both resources and status. Imported objects were not merely beautiful possessions. They helped leaders reward supporters, sponsor ritual, and demonstrate connection with the wider world when such goods became scarce. Political competition might intensify, local crafts could adapt, but some forms of authority depended on controlling what ordinary households could not easily obtain. The rise of Mycenaean centers on the mainland therefore mattered even without a direct invasion. They became competitors, patrons, imitators, and eventually possible masters within the same maritime system. Power in the Bronze Age traveled with ships, gifts, marriages, craftsmen, and stories as much as with weapons. What disappeared most completely was not the population of Crete, but a particular arrangement of institutions, scripts, elite styles, and political authority. Descendants of Bronze Age inhabitants remained on the island, mixed with newcomers, and carried forward practices whose origins may have been forgotten. Sacred places continued to attract worship. Some divine names entered Greek tradition, craft techniques survived in altered forms, and myths preserved a sense of ancient Cretan power. Genetic studies also support substantial continuity among Aegean populations while showing movement and mixture. As would be expected in a connected sea, it is therefore misleading to imagine the Minoans as a vanished race. Civilization is not a biological substance that disappears when a palace burns. It is a changing set of relationships, habits, symbols, and institutions. Some elements end, others migrate, and others are renamed until their ancestry becomes invisible. The civilization was forgotten most fully within written history, because its own language became unreadable, and later, historians inherited stories without archives. Yet the land never forgot, walls remained beneath crops, pottery surfaced after rain, caves retained offerings, and local people lived among places whose antiquity was obvious even when their chronology was unknown. The phrase completely forgotten is therefore powerful, but not literal. It describes the loss of a coherent identity, not the erasure of every memory. Knossos survived as a name, Minos survived as a king. The labyrinth survived as an image, and Crete survived as a sacred and storied island. Archaeology did not create the past from nothing. It gathered scattered memories, objects, and landscapes into a modern historical category. In recent years, the Minoan palatial centers have been recognized not as one isolated wonder, but as a network of major sites, including Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, Zamynthos, and Kydonia. Each contributes a different setting. From coastal routes and fertile plains to mountain landscapes and urban continuity, this broader recognition moves attention away from one palace and one excavator, allowing the civilization to appear as a complex island society developing across 2 millennia. Preservation remains difficult, tourism brings resources and pressure. Modern cities cover ancient layers, earthquakes continue, and climate affects exposed plaster and stone. Caring for these sites requires cooperation between archaeologists, conservators, local communities, and public institutions. The future of the Minoan past depends on choices made in the present, just as its first rediscovery depended on the politics of an earlier age. So the answer to our question is gentler and more complicated than the title first suggests. Europe's first great palace civilization was forgotten because no continuous tradition could read its language, because its administrative world collapsed, because later Greeks remembered it through myth rather than history, because classical Athens and Rome overshadowed the deeper Bronze Age, because palaces were buried and ordinary lives left few named records, and because modern scholarship took time to recognize that colorful ruins on Crete belonged to a society older than the familiar Greek world. It was not forgotten because it lacked achievement, and it was not destroyed in one perfect catastrophe. It faded from explanation while surviving in fragments. Now, as the island grows quiet in imagination, the central courts stand empty beneath a field of stars. The painted dolphins move only in the mind, storage jars rest in long shadowed rooms, and a scribe presses one final sign into damp clay, without knowing that fire will preserve it for people born thousands of years later. Beyond the walls, olive branches shift in the night breeze. A path climbs toward a mountain sanctuary, and somewhere along the coast, a vessel lies ready for dawn. The names of its crew are lost, but their world is no longer entirely silent. Every excavation, every careful measurement, every undeciphered sign and every repaired fragment brings us close without pretending that distance has vanished. The Minoans remain between memory and mystery, not a civilization erased, but one transformed, buried, retold, and slowly recognized again. And in that long journey from palace light to historical darkness, then back into human awareness, there is a quiet reminder that the past is never simply gone. It waits in landscapes, in stories, in objects, and in the patient attention of those willing to listen. Yet before we leave Crete entirely, it is worth pausing beside the fragments themselves, because a fresco in a museum can appear whole even when only a small portion is ancient. Conservators arrange surviving plaster, compare pigments, study edges, and decide how much missing space should remain visible. Early restorers often completed scenes boldly, while later practice prefers to distinguish reconstruction from original material. Neither approach is emotionally neutral. A complete image helps visitors imagine movement and color, but an incomplete one preserves the honesty of uncertainty. The Minoan past has always been balanced between these desires, the desire to see and the duty not to invent. Perhaps this is why the civilization feels unusually dreamlike. Its people come toward us in bright profiles, then dissolve at the edge where modern paint begins. Their rooms rise from plans, then vanish above the surviving foundations. Their scripts promise speech, then return us to silence. A child growing up near a palace would have known the civilization differently from any ruler or scribe. The palace might have appeared as a place of festivals, deliveries, rumors, authority, and wonder. Its upper walls bright above surrounding roofs, its storerooms carrying the smell of oil, wool, grain, wood, smoke, and damp clay. The child may have watched ships arrive with unfamiliar cargo, heard several languages in a harbor, learned which paths were sacred, and recognized the signs of approaching winter in the mountains. None of this required understanding the entire political system. Most people live within history without seeing its full pattern. They notice changing prices, missing relatives, new officials, damaged buildings, altered ceremonies, and stories told with increasing concern when the palatial order weakened Ordinary families did not experience a chapter ending. They experienced decisions, whether to remain, move, repair, hide stores, accept a new authority, or seek kin elsewhere. The disappearance of an ancient identity also shows how much civilization depends on institutions of memory, libraries, schools, archives, public rituals, monuments, and repeated names create continuity when those systems fail. Even magnificent achievements can lose their authors. The Minoans built at a scale that shaped the island, traded across great distances, developed scripts, and produced art recognizable after 4,000 years, yet they left no readable historian to explain them. Later societies inherited their ground without inheriting a clear account. This is why forgetting should not be confused with insignificance. Historical fame is not awarded fairly. It favors cultures whose records survive, whose languages are deciphered, whose monuments remain visible, and whose later admirers choose to preserve them. The rediscovery of Minoan Crete also changed the meaning of Europe. It showed that early European complexity did not grow in isolation from surrounding regions. Crete prospered because it stood within a Mediterranean world of exchange, receiving ideas and materials from many directions while reshaping them locally. The island belonged to Europe geographically, but its civilization was inseparable from Africa and Asia, from Egyptian courts, Levantine ports, Anatolian routes, Cycladic islands and mainland communities. This connected origin is more historically accurate than a story of separate civilizations rising behind fixed borders. The Bronze Age, carried difference and influence together, and the Minoans were masters not because they closed themselves away, but because they learned how to participate creatively in a wider world. Perhaps that is the final reason their return feels so compelling. They disturb familiar beginnings. Behind classical columns we find painted plaster. Behind alphabetic Greek we find older scripts. Behind heroic kings we find administrators, farmers, textile workers, sailors, ritual specialists, and craftspeople. Behind the myth of one terrible ending, we find centuries of resilience and adaptation. The forgotten civilization does not replace Greece or Rome as a new, simple origin. It teaches us to distrust simple origins altogether. Every culture grows from earlier worlds, and every world leaves more than one inheritance. The night over Crete is deep now. The mountain ridges have become dark shapes against the sky. The sea repeats its slow movement along beaches and stone harbors, and the ruins rest without needing to answer every question. Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, Zomintos, Kydonia, Gornia, and the smaller settlements remain where generations placed them, some open to moonlight, some hidden beneath modern streets, some still waiting below the soil. The civilization they belonged to was never completely forgotten and never fully remembered. It survived as myth, material, ancestry, and possibility, then returned through excavation into a history still being revised. And as we drift away from the island, the last image is not of collapse but of continuity, an olive tree growing beside ancient stone, its roots moving through layers no living person can see, its leaves turning softly in the same Mediterranean air. And beneath that tree, if imagination is allowed one final quiet moment, there may be a broken cup, a seal stone, or a tablet fragment still waiting in the earth. Not a treasure in the usual sense, but a small surviving part of an ordinary life. Perhaps it once passed through hands that returned home at sunset, shared food, listened to distant music, and looked toward the same mountains. Archaeology may someday recover it, or it may remain where it is for another 1,000 years. Either possibility carries its own peace, because history does not exist only when it is displayed and named. It also rests unseen, held in soil, memory, language, and landscape. The Minoans remind us that absence can contain meaning, that silence can be studied without being conquered, and that a civilization can disappear from books while continuing to shape the world that forgot it.